Welcome to Crisis Management, 5 Steps to Equip and Fortify Your Agency to Thrive During a Crisis. My name is Melanie Lockwood Herman. I'm the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, and it's my pleasure to be your presenter for this session. You'll see on this first slide my phone number and my email address. If you have any questions about any of the information I'm going to share today, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to speak with you. We can exchange email messages. I want to make sure that I answer your questions about this topic or really any risk management topic. And just a reminder, the organization that I work for is a nonprofit, the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, and we were created to inspire effective risk management among leaders of nonprofit and public organizations. And what we really try to focus on is helping leaders become more comfortable talking about risk and coping with risk so their agencies are in position to take more risk to achieve their mission. For today, I want to cover a handful of topics related to crisis management. I want to start with the definition of crisis and then move into what I'm calling crisis management truths. And then we'll move pretty quickly into those 5 steps to equip and fortify your agency, and then final tips and takeaways. So that's the agenda that I have planned. Let's start with the definition of crisis. So in front of you, you see a definition from dictionary.com, a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger, or a time when a difficult or important decision must be made. The word crisis actually comes from a Latin form of the Greek word crisis, which means turning point in a disease. You know, at such a moment, a person with the disease could get better or worse. So it's a critical moment. And that's what really a crisis has come to mean for so many of our agencies. When we hear that word crisis, we often think of a turning point, you know, a time when things could get better or worse. Here's another definition of crisis from a Harvard Business Press publication called Managing Crisis. And this definition is a change, sudden or evolving, that results in an urgent problem that must be addressed immediately. So I went ahead and underlined urgent problem in the word immediately because to me, this is what distinguishes a crisis from another event, right? Another is something else that's happening to our agent. You know, we have to address it right away. And it really reflects urgency. There's urgency to the steps that we take. So now I want to share a few crisis management truths. And these are from a book called Surviving and Thriving in Uncertainty, Creating the Risk Intelligent Enterprise. And these authors talk about the fact that we're not always able to anticipate and prepare for a crisis event. But they say the crisis that we prepare for may not be the one that we actually experience, but any preparation we do will improve our resilience, come what may. And I really like this sentiment, this idea that any preparation could be helpful to the mission of our organization, even if we're planning for a crisis that doesn't happen, and the one that does happen is not the one we planned for. So it's kind of an interesting thought that preparation can be really helpful. So as you think about the types of crisis events that your agency might face, I made a list of some things that come to mind. Some of the things that could happen that would probably be characterized as a crisis. Certainly serious injury or death to a client, to a staff member, impossibility of reaching key stakeholders. Certainly a lawsuit is a crisis, leads to a crisis for many agencies, loss of funding, the inability to pay basic expenses, the impossibility of delivering core services, a scandal or negative media attention, and certainly the risk of going out of business, right? The risk of insolvency would be a crisis across the board. So now let's shift and talk about these 5 steps. And I hope that some, if not all of them, feel really relevant and feel like steps that you can take and that you can reflect on to really help your organization be as resilient as possible and survive the next crisis that you face. So the first tip is to prepare for impacts, not events. So the traditional approach in crisis management is to prepare for specific events. So if there is a fear of a hurricane, we want to prepare for a hurricane. If there's fear of a terrorist event, we want to prepare for that. And yet what happens is sometimes leaders of agencies get bogged down creating long lists of crisis events. And the next step then is to create separate plans for each of those events. And yet the reality is that many different types of crisis events have similar impacts and similar effects on an organization. So my theory is that if you prepare for impacts instead of events, you're going to cover the planning steps and preparation more efficiently. So let's look at how impacts and events differ or compare. So here we are looking at a series of crisis events, right? Hurricane, tornado, workplace violence, COVID-19, fraud, abuse of a client, death of a staff member, tragic accident. So these are the events. Now let's take a look at the impacts, right? So regardless of which crisis event we have on the right-hand side, we're likely to face a lot of the impacts that you see on the left-hand side of your screen. So difficulty reaching people, potential litigation, withdrawal of funders, difficulty meeting basic expenses, difficulty delivering services, and potentially negative media scrutiny. Any of those impacts could happen and be related to any of those crisis events, right? So there are many different impacts that we face as leaders of organizations, regardless of the type of crisis that we face. All right, number 2 on my list is to pay obsessive focus to near misses. So it's very interesting. The research on near misses suggests that many crisis events that are experienced by organizations are actually preceded by warning signs or near misses. And unfortunately, sometimes when we have a near miss, when someone almost got hurt, right? We almost lost our major funding source, but it didn't actually happen. We tend to think of those near misses as successes, right? The person wasn't injured, right? The funding wasn't lost. And the truth is that, when we think about learning from failure, it's almost become a cliche. It's hard to do, right? I think many of us think to ourselves when we fail, when we misstep, we just won't do that again, right? We won't let that happen again. But it's much harder to learn from near misses and to learn from failures. So I want to delve a little bit more into this with step number 3, which is to double down on failure analysis. I want you to be thinking about any time your agency experiences a failure or a mistake, that it's an incredible opportunity to learn. And that when you have a bad outcome, when things don't turn out the way you expect or want them to, it doesn't mean that your agency is poorly managed. It doesn't mean that anybody intentionally caused this harm or loss. A bad outcome does not mean bad people. And in fact, some of the most innovative companies and organizations in our country and in our economy embrace failure. And they try to fail fast. They try to learn from failure all the time. And failing is part of innovation. It's part of the innovation process. So some of the weaknesses in failure analysis is the first one, and these are inspired by the work of Amy Edmondson, who's a professor at the Harvard Business School. She's written extensively about failure, and I love her work. I love the analysis she's done on failure in organizational life. So much kind of wonderful learning from that work that she's done. The first thing she says is that we approach learning too simplistically. An example of that is when we fail, we say to ourselves or others, we won't let that happen again. Fool me once kind of thing. Another weakness is that when we fail or make mistakes, we tend to favor or prefer evidence that supports our existing beliefs rather than exploring alternative explanations. And this can get in the way of really understanding the reasons for failure. And then the third reason is what's called fundamental attribution error, which is a form of cognitive bias. And the way this works is as follows. With fundamental attribution error, when we fail, so if I were to fail, this cognitive bias leads me to believe that the failure was someone else's responsibility, or it was because of something beyond my control. Whereas when I succeed, I tend to believe that it was because of my own commitment or skill or knowledge or talent, right? So we downplay our responsibility when we fail. We blame others. We blame external situations. We blame things beyond our control. And then when we succeed, the opposite of this, when we succeed, we attribute it to our own character, our commitment, our talent, skills, and so forth. So it's really interesting cognitive bias. And then the fourth weakness and failure analysis that comes up over and over again is this tendency to fail to move beyond a very simple kind of initial explanation for the failure, right? So if a mistake is made in an agency, there's often a tendency to blame a human being, to identify who was closest to the situation, who made a mistake. Well, that was Melanie. She just didn't follow procedure, or she doesn't take her job seriously, or she's prone to failure, right? Instead of saying, well, what was happening behind the scenes? What was going on such that Melanie made this mistake? Maybe it was more than just her lack of commitment or knowledge or training. Maybe she had too many things going on at the same time. Maybe the expectations for her job were unrealistic. Maybe she was getting mixed messages from two different people that she reported to. So it's very easy to oversimplify and go with the first order analysis when we fail. But what we really need to do if we want to learn from failure is to kind of move beyond that simple approach. All right, number 4 on my list is to address the internal sources of a future crisis. You know, many people believe that the biggest crisis risk they face will come from the outside. It will be somebody who's hacking into your system, somebody, a person from another country, from a different part of the world, who's trying to steal your data, somebody who wants to commit a crime against your agency, perhaps. We imagine these crisis events caused by third parties, when in fact, many crisis events happen from within. And they're caused by, and the seeds of those crisis events are happening within the organization. So I've just given you a few examples. The first one, lack of alignment between teams leads to infighting and power struggles. I've certainly seen this in organizations. I've seen this where it led to a leader being asked to leave, being forced out of an agency because of infighting. Competing priorities consume all resources, right? Where an agency is spread too thin and it has too many things going on and it can't be successful in any area because it's got too many projects, too many activities, too many functions, and not enough resources are being spent on any one of those functions. And that can lead to a crisis event. And then, of course, an unsustainable business model where, you know, the sources of funding are drying up or are declining, and yet you're continuing with that business model. So these are kind of just examples of how a crisis can start from things happening inside the agency, that not all crisis events are happening or take place because of the actions of a third party, of an unknown party, an outsider. So there's a great book, newer book by Dan Heath, who some of you have heard of, I'm sure. It's called Upstream. And I love this quote, you know, when everything is cause for alarm, nothing is cause for alarm. And what he says in the book is that sometimes early warning systems work wonders, but other times they cause more harm than benefit. The key factor is the prevalence of false positives, warnings that incorrectly signal trouble. So I see this in some of the nonprofits and public agencies that we work with, where the team is spending every day fighting fires, putting out fires, dealing with crisis events. And it's impossible to do that day after day, year after year. So if every day feels like a crisis at your agency, you need to focus on and figuring out why that is. You know, why are we constantly facing these crisis events? You know, how do we make sure that we can conserve energy for the real crisis that may still be coming? Number 5 on my list is to tap the power of negative thinking. And I know this may sound like a strange tip or strategy for managing in a crisis or doing some crisis management planning. But I think sometimes we can really focus by trying this technique. So this is what I would suggest. You know, I would take a scenario and, you know, think about, if this happens, this is what we will do, right? This is what's next, right? If this, then that kind of scenario. And I would ask yourself, you know, what's the worst that could happen, right? And then what? And then what next? Kind of play out these scenarios, maybe sitting with a team of people in your agency and just, you know, identifying those crisis risks, those things that you're most concerned about happening, and playing it through with, if this happens, what will we do? then what's the worst that can happen? Then what will we do? And then what next? And just kind of continuing through that exercise. I'm going to show you a worksheet you can use that may be helpful as well in planning for crisis events. So I call this the 10 worst things list. It's essentially a spreadsheet or a chart that you can create in Word or in PowerPoint. And in the second column, you want to list some of these worst things, some of these crisis events that you're concerned about, that if this were to happen, this would be significantly impactful on our agency, on our ability to operate and be successful. So I want you to then identify what are those things that if this happens, what are the things you're going to do when it happens, right? Those are the do then things. And those would be in the third column. And then in the fourth column, that's where you're going to list what are the things you're going to do now to make sure that your agency is better prepared for that crisis event. Some of those do now things may be things you can do, steps you can take to avoid the crisis altogether, while others may be things that you can do to reduce the likelihood of a crisis event or reduce its total cost on your agency or impact, negative impact. All right, let's go through a few final tips and takeaways as we wrap up. The first is to take your mind for a walk. And I love this quote about original thinking. You know, original thinking needs a longer leash. Taking your mind for a walk to exactly the same place doesn't really exercise it. You can't connect different things together if what you're seeing is always the same. So this is all about being creative and allowing yourselves to see different pathways, different ways to achieve a solution or to better prepare for a crisis. You know, the cliche expression that we all use from time to time is thinking outside the box. I think this is just a much more eloquent way of saying that, right? You know, take your mind for a walk to a different place, to a new place, to kind of come up with great solutions. And as you do that, I would encourage you to think about, you know, how has your agency handled a crisis in the past? Was your handling of that crisis, you know, as effective as you would like it to be? What can you do differently to better handle the next crisis? And this is a quote from John Hunt, who wrote a terrific book called The Art of the Idea, one of my favorite reads from this year. And it just reminds me of this idea that uncertainty in the world and in our organizations is a chance to learn and grow. And he talks about, you know, even learning to enjoy uncertainty, and says it's difficult to have an epiphany if all you want revealed is what you already know. I love that sentiment. I think it's really, really powerful. And that's from The Art of the Idea by John Hunt. Great book. Great book. My next tip is to look for the silver linings. So every crisis that your organization faces will have a silver lining, and often more than one. There's a great quote from Alexander Graham Bell, who said, "When one door closes, another door opens, but we do often look so long and regretfully upon the closed door that we do not see the ones which open for us." And I think this is so true in a crisis, that we're so consumed by what's happening and consumed with the downsides and the negative impacts of a crisis, that we fail to stop and just reflect on the positives, the good things. During the global pandemic, I've been asking colleagues to share with me, you know, what have you learned? What have you learned about your agency that's inspiring? You know, what surprised you about how your agency responded to COVID-19? And what makes you hopeful about the future? The next tip is to give your team permission to break. Unfortunately, when we're in the middle of a crisis, sometimes we feel like we have to keep going and we can't stop, we can't take a breath. And the opposite is true. It's really important that we give everybody permission to stop doing something so they can handle the crisis more capably, so they frees up time to handle the crisis, right? It's impossible to handle the crisis and continue to do all those things you were doing before the crisis began. So I've created this sample stop, start cheat sheet, right? Where I've made a list of those things that I'm going to stop doing and things that I'm going to start doing. And you may find this helpful. A stop, start chart may be helpful. Maybe you want to prepare it for the whole team, or you want to work with a team to create one, or maybe each person does this. Each person on your team identifies those things that there's no need to rush and do these things because we need to do other things. We need to free up space for other things, right? So just an example of a tool that you can use to kind of practice this idea of giving everybody giving everybody permission to break. And then the next tip is to reflect on long-term implications. As you're making decisions in a crisis, when stress levels are high and there seems to be a lot of pressure and a sense of urgency, those decisions are really important, but sometimes they have long-term implications for your agency. So I would encourage you to ask things like, can this decision be undone? Have we considered not only the intended consequences of this decision, but possibly the unintended consequences, right? Those things that we don't want to happen as a result of this decision. And will this decision support the realization of our mission in the long run, not just here and now, but in the long run as well? My next tip is to capture lessons learned from the crisis. So you've probably heard the quote about, I think it's attributed to Winston Churchill about, never waste a crisis, right? Never waste a crisis. And really, I think a lot of organizations do move very quickly on from a crisis. And there's this need and desire to move on to something more positive than the crisis. But the truth is we need to spend some time pausing and reflecting and learning from every crisis we experience. And so I've created this lessons learned worksheet that you can use in your organization. On the left-hand side, I've indicated the nature of the crisis I have in mind, and I'm thinking about COVID-19. And then the next column, I've listed some actions taken. And then I switch in the third column and talk about lessons. And then the fourth column is what next, what now? Based on what we've learned, based on what we experienced in this recent crisis, what are we going to do differently moving forward? And my next tip is to be both patient and impatient. And I love this quote, be impatient for action, but patient for outcomes. Things take time. And just because we announce something new or we say something's going to be done, the true impact of that something, of that change in policy, practice, and so forth, will take time. So don't obsess about creating the perfect crisis management plan. It's better to create a plan and work through it, right? Work through it when you're in a crisis situation and figure out if that plan works well for you, if it was helpful. I love Dan Heath's quote is to take ownership of the underlying problem and start slogging forward. So again, be impatient for your actions, right, to get started dealing with something, but recognize that sometimes the impact of those actions will take time to be felt. And then my last tip is to reach out for help. In this organization, at the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, we believe very strongly that asking for help is a strength, not a weakness. It's a sign of strength. When you raise your hand and say, I need help, you're acknowledging some vulnerability, you're being vulnerable, and you're acknowledging lack of the knowledge that you need or the skills that you need. And you're saying to somebody, I need help. I can't do this on my own. And we treat that. That's one of the highest values we have, is that when somebody asks you for help, you help them. You stop what you're doing and you help them. So it's not acceptable to tell a coworker, I'm busy, get back with me tomorrow, or how about next week, right? When someone asks for help, they're really putting themselves out there. And so we want to respond appropriately by saying, yes, I'm here to help. So when you're in a crisis, when you're preparing for a crisis, when you're working on your crisis management plan, whatever stage you're at, I want to encourage you to reach out for help. There are lots of people and organizations that want to help you. I want to point out some resources on nonprofitrisk.org, which is our website. We have our magazine, which is called Risk Management Essentials. We have both a crisis management edition of the magazine, as well as a business continuity planning issue of the magazine. I hope you'll take a chance to look at these materials. They're PDF files. You can print them. You can save them to your hard drive. Each issue contains 3 articles on the topic. So I hope you'll find that useful. There are lots and lots of resources available to you on the risk management portal that we developed in partnership with the Community Action Partnership. You can access that portal at nonprofitrisk.org/CAP. So definitely check that out. And again, lots of resources, articles, quizzes on nonprofitrisk.org. I hope you'll sign up for our Risky News. Some of you I know are readers already, but we publish almost every week. And recently, certainly during the pandemic, we've been writing a lot about resilience. We've been writing about business continuity planning, and we even developed a resilience quiz, which is kind of fun and gives you some specific tips based on how you rate in terms of organizational resilience. Remember that you can ask us questions. You can send those by email. You can give me a call. Questions about any risk issue, any crisis management issue that you're facing, or you can use our risk help form. So it doesn't cost anything to pose those questions, and I promise we'll get back to you just as soon as possible. Thank you so much for listening to this program. You've got my contact information on this final slide. I really encourage you to reach out to me with questions about any of the content that I've gone over, or just any question related to risk management or crisis management. Thanks so much.